What's the point of liberalism, and can it make us happy? Check it out.
The promises of the end of history and the sort of new dawn of freedom just haven't led to a happier, more optimistic life. There are more people than ever within, the last, 70 years or something who say life was better before. They feel that humanity is doomed and things like that. So, as you said, I think that that's clearly a question of meaning and purpose. And liberalism is designed specifically not to give that kind of meaning and purpose. It often feels to me as though contemporary liberalism wants to say that you shouldn't think about those things at all, or if you do, you're entirely on your own, and you can only find it within yourself.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today we have Dr. Michael Bonner with us. He is an historian. He's got his PhD from Oxford. He's the former director of policy with the government of Ontario. He's a political consultant. He's a dad. He's got 3 kids. He's author of several books now. And today we talked about his latest book called The Crisis of Liberalism, The Origin and Destiny of Freedom. Now, this episode was heavy. Basically, Dr. Bonner tries to package 2,000 years of history focusing on liberalism into a couple hundred pages, and he accomplishes it. I suggest you go out and buy this book. If you're really into medieval thought and following the ideas of liberalism across 2 millennia, then you're going to love this book. I learned a lot from it. I enjoyed it immensely. One of the big topics that we had to wrestle with was whether or not we've left behind the medieval era. He argues that many of the ideas that we're talking about today come from medieval thought and are still applicable to what we're talking about right now. So very wide-ranging discussion. We eventually came around to talking about what can we do about it now? Where do we go from here? How can we rescue society when we're trapped in some of these distorted conceptions of where ideas come from? And he does offer a sense of hope towards the end, which I think is excellent. Certainly a book that's worth having on your shelf just because he writes so well. It's clear, it's articulate, and he's able to take really complex topics and put them into a language that everyone can understand. So thanks again for stopping by. Let's get on with the show. Michael Bonner, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you making the time. I read a lot of books, but I rarely enjoy a book as much as I enjoyed your latest book, and it's titled The Crisis of Liberalism, The Origin and Destiny of Freedom. As far as I know, we don't have many Canadian authors writing in this space, but I just wanted to open it up with not just an elevator pitch, but hopefully give us a little bit more than the elevator pitch. What's your book about? Why'd you write it?
It's a strange and winding story. I think we've been hearing about problems with liberalism for a long time. Certainly the famous Francis Fukuyama book that came out in 1992 was widely misunderstood as predicting the sort of, imminent unfolding of a golden age of freedom and democracy and prosperity everywhere. But then it was obvious that actually very few people read to the end of the book, where Fukuyama then predicts his sort of inherent problems and sort of looming tensions between demand for personal equality as well as the demand to stand out and distinguish oneself from others. So this has been going on for a very long time. I think, at least in my lifetime, to me, it seems like this question has always been cropping up, circulating every so often. And then the question occurred to me to, well, if there is a problem, if there is some sort of crisis, what is the crisis? How would you describe it? What are its features and so forth? Well, I think that a lot of people prefer to think of the trouble with liberalism as something akin to the lack of a proper procedure or failure to enforce some kind of norm or other. And I won't say that that's necessarily wrong, but I don't think it's the full story. I think that fundamentally it's a question of belief. What should a right-thinking liberal believe? What should what should be the right orientation of a Western liberal toward a theory of personal freedom or democracy, or what should we believe about these things? That also raises a more fundamental question, which is basically, what is liberalism? A lot of people construe liberalism as tantamount to democracy, Enlightenment values. You'll hear a lot of that stuff. Well, again, what do those things mean? What do they require us to believe? What should a person, how should a person think and feel about himself, the world, and other people, and so forth, if he or she espouses liberalism? So those are the fundamental questions. A friend of mine who is on the CIC board asked me to write a book about this subject, and I warned him. I said, well, I'll do it. I find it very interesting, but my take is going to be weird. I'm going to focus on belief, and I'm going to tell you where liberal beliefs come from and why and how they have gone wrong, why they have become harder to believe in. That's the basis of it, and as you no doubt discovered, gets into some weeds, which I think some people may find, as I say, weird.
No, weird and wonderful. We often assume liberalism has a monopoly on the word liberal, whereas Edmund Burke, old Whig, he wanted to protect the Constitution, balance of powers, and he wanted to protect the liberties that the English had already achieved to that point, so the late 18th century. He loved freedom in that sense, but he wasn't a proponent of liberalism when you make it into an ideology. So I wonder if you could just say a few thoughts or share your thoughts on liberal versus liberalism, and we're going to unpack what liberalism is, because you also say on page 130, you were talking about Cold War liberalism. I thought a beautiful section there. And you said, well, this is actually kind of largely a reflection of what I think. And I thought, oh, okay. So we have to unpack liberal versus liberalism. And then feel free to share where you're landing on this, or maybe we can save your personal thoughts till the very end. However you want to approach it, liberal versus liberalism, and whether or not there's a monopoly on the term within liberalism itself.
So, my first warning is that we should not be hung up on terminology. And I think a lot of people who discuss these subjects get bogged down in who calls himself a liberal or not, or who uses that term or not. If you focus only on the use of the term liberal in a political sense, as I argue, you end up with a view of a kind of sudden appearance of what we call liberalism in probably in the mid 18th or possibly the early 19th century, depending on who you're looking at. John Locke, for instance, who is often construed as the grandfather of liberalism, doesn't use that word, or at least not in. He doesn't use the term to describe a political outlook or a theory, and neither does Machiavelli, whom some people think is the first liberal, and neither does Montaigne. And of course, there's this kind of strange quest for the world's first liberal, which I think is kind of a peculiar preoccupation. That's not important. What's important is the idea that personal freedom should be our main political preoccupation, that politics is for securing and preserving and defending personal freedom. Now, if you think of it that way, which is, you can find it, I mean, practically everywhere, but it's made very explicit in the work of people like Judith Shklar, Isaiah Berlin, and I think even going back to certainly to John Stuart Mill, Locke, and others, but I mean in an explicit sort of verbatim formula of that idea. However, you find it in other forms, not necessarily so explicit, not so literal, basically throughout all Western history, going back a long time. Now, this is a distinction, though, that we have to be very careful of. There's this theory of ancient liberty and then a more, modern kind. And this is Benjamin Constant drawing this distinction in the 19th century. But the distinction isn't his own. He's simply making an observation. So personal liberty, personal freedom has meant different things at different times. The liberal view of it is certainly contested. It's certainly debated. It has, exactly what needs to be done to secure personal freedom has changed over time. It is not the same vision as, contrary to what a lot of people would like to believe or like to assert. Modern ideas of liberalism, modern ideas of personal freedom are very different from those of the ancient world. Cicero and what you find in Thucydides, or the famous Paradoxes oration and things like that. What they're saying about freedom, what freedom means, is a very different idea. So I infer from this what I think is pretty simple assertion, but I'm sure many people will disagree with it, that there is a long historical discourse of freedom in what may be called the West. Not all of it is liberal, but liberalism properly construed makes personal freedom the primary political concern. It is contrasted in the liberal discourse with tyranny, with oppression, with constraint on freedom. Now, to many in the West, that seems very obvious. It seems like a very clear, straightforward dichotomy. Elsewhere, however, that isn't quite so clear. An entire book could be written on this subject. In, for example, classical Islamic political theory, there's of course an idea of freedom, what it means to be free, but it isn't contrasted with tyranny. What is contrasted with tyranny, and what becomes the primary political concern in that tradition, in that civilization, justice. Now, we also have a theory of justice. There's, John Rawls wrote a book. John Rawls, the arch 20th century liberal, he wrote a book called The Theory of Justice. But it's not the same idea. It isn't the same contrast. We in the West have peculiarly placed this emphasis on personal political freedom, and we have peculiarly contrasted it with tyranny. The solution to tyranny is always portrayed as personal freedom, which is not to say that we don't have a theory of justice also, as Rawls and others have said, but it doesn't take shape as the primary political concern. Now, I think buried within that is somehow an answer to your question, which I'd forgotten.
So let's start with John Gray and the very beginning of your book. And one of his pillars of liberalism is to say that liberalism is universalistic, or it believes in universalism. And then, however, you've said that liberals tend to be nominalists overall. So I wonder if you could talk about Gray and then maybe correct my misinterpretation of liberals tending towards nominalism.
Okay, so Gray, I don't know if actually Gray is the first to do this. He may very well be. He gives the four assumptions of liberalism, things that must be sort of believed or taken for granted in order for a doctrine of freedom to be considered liberal. So basically we have universal equality, free will, the supremacy of the individual, and a kind of theory of progress in history, or like he calls it meliorism, that things can get better and improve. And I add, and I completely agree with that, with those four, and so does Fukuyama, but I add one, which I think was critically left out, which is this and actually I think it's weird that it was left out. think it's peculiar, that there is a primordial division of the world into a religious realm and a secular realm. The liberals all assume that, and I think it needs to be included. That assumption needs to be included for any doctrine of freedom to meet the threshold. Okay, so again, I have to consult my book here. So the universal equality of all human beings, free will, supremacy of the individual, theory of progress in history, and the separation of the religious and the secular. Okay, why does liberalism assume those things? The argument usually goes like this. At some point in the early modern period, following the Reformation, people decided that there was too much conflict about religion and various sorts of different beliefs. The 30 Years' War, the wars of religion in France, the English Civil Wars, and somebody decided, we just have to stop. We're going to be secular, and everything is going to come down to individual exercise of free will and free choice, and on and on and on. And then, if you're Henry Kissinger or whatever, you'll throw in the Peace of Westphalia as this sort of a great turning point in European history, and you'll claim that someone like Luther or maybe Erasmus or someone in there is the first liberal, or Hobbes. Gray really likes Hobbes. I don't find Hobbes a likable person, but he certainly has an interesting writing style. And Gray and company consider Hobbes to be sort of archetypical liberal. Okay, some people also say Descartes, or anyway, somewhere in there, there's the world's first liberal. I think that that's wrong, and I think that I successfully prove it. Those axioms, those assumptions of liberalism that Gray gives, again, I don't quarrel with them at all. They're exactly right. I just want to add one more. Every one of those assumptions grows out of a much older medieval discussion, and in some cases earlier, going back to late antiquity, about human freedom, and they emerge from Christian theology, Western Christian theology. I think I could have pointed that up maybe in the book a little bit more. These ideas are found to some extent within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but they don't find political expression in the same way at all. The Byzantine political thought is quite unlike the Western equivalent. So unfortunately, we're just going to have to leave that aside and not pursue that. But in the West, this question of personal freedom, of the exercise of free will, equality, and so forth, comes out of a discourse of freedom by Christian theology. Now, people will probably find that surprising, particularly because of this question of the secularism of liberalism. But that is a huge misunderstanding, because even the notion as to what is a secular thing is one that was defined by religion. And you find in someone like John Calvin and Luther this very peculiar assertion, like in the Institutes of Calvin and in the Luther's letter to the German princes. They both say, this is the most obvious and clear, straightforward, primordial distinction that has always held good. Nobody has established it. It is in the state of nature, basically. They don't use that term, but they talk about an obvious, a primordial between the religious and the secular world. And so the idea that somebody invented this is not would have been news to early modern people. And getting into the details is probably going to take us all day, so I won't do that. But the conflict between Pope and Emperor in the West, which didn't take place elsewhere in the Christian world, that's what shapes that assumption that there is some kind of fundamental distinction there. And it's not the world saying we don't want anything to do with your popery or whatever. It's the medieval papacy and the church saying the world has corrupted our religion, and we're going to make this distinction now, and we're going to purify our institutions from what we see as worldly influence. Now, that's just one example, but I'll give you another. Actually two more. First one, very straightforward. The idea that human beings are equal to one another, and that there's no the sort of anti-hierarchical thought in Western Christianity, that reposes on the assumption of creation in the image and likeness of God. There's no other, and if you look at late antique pagan authors who are familiar with this distinction, they think it's absolutely preposterous. It has no ancient equivalent. Even Plato's idea of a kind of quasi-divine soul, it did not lead to an idea of really quite radical equality amongst all human beings. And the question of free will, that is not an ancient idea. When Plato and Aristotle talk about free will, they're talking about a kind of faculty belonging to reason. They don't use that term either. They talk about sort of reason choosing something for rational reasons. That you don't have this concept that there's a kind of like mental or spiritual event that happens before you choose something. That's a Christian idea. But the way we have come to think about free will was shaped by in the Middle Ages, which were not actually centered on human will. They were centered on the divine will. And the human will must be a reflection of the divine will. As the scholastics, seemed very obvious to them because of the creation, the theory of the creation, the image and likeness of God. Now, who is considered, if you're one of these people who thinks that there must be some kind of prototypical liberal, and you settle on someone like Descartes, you've settled on a man with a medieval mind. His whole notion of the will, which is very, very important in Cartesian thought, that the will is directing the mental attention toward things, and that the will is the most powerful faculty that can shape our perception and so forth, and it's ultimately presiding over the whole human person as a monarch in his kingdom. This is a very old idea by the time we hear it in Descartes. And we have come in the West, we have come to think of the will, the human will, as the supreme faculty that can determine even guilt or innocence, or degrees of guilt or innocence in our legal system. It matters very much whether you needed to do something, whether something was voluntary. And of course, our entire mode of democratic thought would make no sense unless the democratic will, the will of each individual person choosing to vote a certain way or not a certain way, were wholly voluntary and entirely unconstrained. That is one of the least obvious things, one of the least straightforward things you can assert, and what you certainly cannot prove. Or if you can prove it, there's or if you purport to try to prove it, no successful non-theological proof has yet been advanced. And you will find in the work of many modern contemporary persons, Sam Harris, Yuval Harari, or whatever his name is, and another fellow who I quote, I can't remember his name. In any case, they don't take for granted the idea of a free will, and in fact, they assert the exact opposite, and they seem to prove it with some success. You have to assume, in the case of liberalism and in democracy, that there is such a thing as a will, that it is wholly free and unconstrained, and that there is something good about exercising it that way. And I would consider that a fairly galvanizing, like pretty sure proof that the way we have come to think about these things is shaped by much, much older debates, and they don't come out of nowhere suddenly in the early days of the sort of post-Reformation world.
Yeah, that was brilliant. I think that's the main thesis of your book. And I was teasing you on Twitter or X, page 79, quote, "We who are living still have not left the medieval thought world," end quote. And that seems to be the main message coming through in the first half of your book. You're saying, you guys don't know your history. Look, this is here, this is there. And then you also say on page 38, quote, "The ancient world knew no such article of faith," end quote, talking about free will. And so in that, you also just finished attacking the conventional wisdom on page 73. You talk about the conventional narrative that things were bad, we were killing each other, and then liberalism came and settled the wars, and we had this wonderful era of peace that followed. But given all that, so you've said medieval thought really gave birth to a lot of these ideas that we cherish within liberalism. They weren't there in the ancient world. Free will is the big example we were just talking about. This creates a problem for us, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this as a historian. Leo Strauss, I'm not a Straussian, although I went through a Straussian phase. He wrote a famous essay called The Three Waves of Modernity, and how we can see waves as being individual distinct events, but they're all connected to the wave before. And so I'm wondering, well, is Dr. Bonner saying, look, this wave actually presupposes two waves before it, and so therefore they're the same thing. There aren't any distinct waves. So there's the tension there with the different and the same, or elasticity. It looks like you're wanting to jump in. Go ahead, say something. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, I would never say don't go back to Plato, or like don't read your Aristotle. I would never say that. But the idea that you can gain some insight into this is going to sound like a paradox. The idea that you can gain insight into a Christian thought world, which is what I believe liberalism is, by reading Plato and Aristotle, I think is, or Thucydides might be a better example. And I just think that that's absurd. Nevertheless, people like Karl Popper, who have been thoroughly brought up in this, Christian thought world of liberalism, they do end up finding what they're looking for in Thucydides, because they're reading him through they're reading their own assumptions into that text. Now, obviously, a lot of medieval people did that with, less so with Plato, because there's very little Plato available until a bit later, but certainly with a lot of with Aristotelian logic, and then later on with the metaphysics. I don't think that I mean, just like this, you can see if you read, if anyone is so inclined to read Aquinas on the age of the question of the eternity of the world, you will see that he's quite ingeniously twisting himself into a pretzel to suggest that there's both a creation, and Aristotle must be right somehow about the eternity of the world, because from God's perspective, the creation occurred outside of time, and it's sort of instantaneous anyway. So, in the end, both Revelation and Aristotle are right. So, that kind of thing, of course, did happen. But the idea that there's this I forget the exact term that you use. Like basically the Fukuyama thesis about early modernity, liberalism having a virgin birth in early modernity is an illusion created by our perception of these things. Now, the very idea that you can, number one, have a progressive vision of history whereby one thing naturally leads on to another. I mean, that's simple. That's just this idea that there's an evolution of a moral that eventually is written on the heart, and that there's a progressive unfolding of these stages of history that you find in Joachim of Fiore and stuff like that. That's one thing. But then there's this urge to throw some kind of barrier across time and say that now at this point we have moved into a new age. The end of history is upon us, and we think and believe differently. You can see that those two things are somehow related, and yet you can also see that there's some kind of tension there. And depending on how one thinks or feels about a certain issue, one will be inclined to stress either the evolutionary thing or the sudden break and then the sort of step into a new age. And you find both in liberalism, and you find both in all stages of post-Christian European thought. Now we're getting kind of off topic, but the whole theory of this new age and this some kind of new phase of life has dawned. You find that in all the earliest historical sources on the First Crusade, for example. You find also the idea, as we alluded before, with this idea of the papacy cleaning up the church and purging corruption and so forth. That this is the beginning of a new age, and it is in the context in the 11th century, in that context where the first use of the word modernity occurs, and the author, who's no one has ever heard of him, his name is Berthold of Rau. He's a German writing in Latin. He's describing this. He is the first person to use that word modernity, or at least to record it. So, paradoxically, the concept of a modern age is a medieval idea. And it's only we who look back on the past and see ourselves as being different from the Middle Ages, whereas Berthold and company sitting in Rome in the early 11th century, that's how they saw themselves. Mm-hmm. That there was a new age that had arrived, and anyway, it's another paradox that there is nothing more modern than being a medieval person.
Yeah, so again, an impossible question and beautiful comments. But I wanted to maybe bring out this a little bit more. And I warned you we'd talk about the Hegelian view of history, which really you've been describing. And just for our listeners, and I loved your section on Hegel. You said he's almost impossible to understand. I said, oh, great. I actually know that this guy's telling the truth, because if he's honest about Hegel, most people write about Hegel as though they understand him. And I'm always suspicious about that a little bit, but I'll grant
you're
that.
Right to be, yeah.
Yeah, I'll grant that some people maybe understand it. But this Hegelian view of history, we've all heard the term the arc of history and make sure we're standing on the right side of history. But it comes with the presupposition that everything that happened yesterday is really of less relevance than what's happening today and won't be anywhere near as relevant as what we learn tomorrow. Now, your whole argument seems to presuppose that a Hegelian view of history is not the whole story. And so in that sense, you almost seem to be setting yourself offside of the whole liberal establishment. Liberalism writ large seems to assume a Hegelian view of history, where progress is good. Meliorism, we can fix the world. Tomorrow's a better day. And besides, we can never really know what those old guys believed and thought anyways, because we're stuck in modernity. You're saying, no, that's not the case. The ideas we have today are actually medieval ideas. And actually, those old ideas are still very, very relevant today. And so how do you sort that tension out? You seem to be opposing all the big liberal writers who seem to assume a Hegelian view of history.
Okay, so I'm not going to say that the progressive view of history is necessarily wrong. The problem comes when you forget why you believe something. So I call those 5 assumptions of liberalism, I call them sort of like axioms. Okay, they become axioms in effect. An axiom is a thing that you have to assume is true, but you can't necessarily prove in mathematics, like parallel lines don't meet. Right. So, but imagine if although I think some people say parallel lines do that. I don't know.
Right.
But anyway, imagine if you forgot why, like if you had solved I don't know what the right terminology is. If you had solved the quadratic formula or something, or if you had found the sum of the square, or I don't know. I don't really understand anything about mathematics. But if you had reached the end of that process, and you had the answer, the conclusion, or the solution, but you had forgotten all the other stuff, you would be in quite a mess, I would say. The same is true of liberalism. If you forget why all those 5 assumptions were originally believed. So if you're left with this assertion that we're all equal, or you're left with this assertion that there's free will, and then someone says, well, how do you know? And then you just say, well, I can't tell you, and I don't feel that I should have to.
Right.
Then you're in real trouble.
Yeah.
Okay. People will laugh at that. I think they'll say, well, again, what are you talking about? Why is this important? Okay. Well, look at the opening to the Declaration of the American Declaration of Independence, where it says, what does it say after a short preamble? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, they're not self-evident, or rather, they are only self-evident if you already believe the arguments that lead to them, or the theological foundation that supports them. Now, in a context in which everybody has been, and I mean that almost literally, where practically every single person has for centuries and generations has been exposed to these beliefs and assumptions, and you've heard us and monks and everything who are associated with almost every aspect of daily life. When you've been hearing this over and over and over and over again, of course you wouldn't question it. But sooner or later, you will lose once you lose the theology and the scholastic arguments that underpin these things. Sooner or later, it just becomes difficult or impossible to understand. Now, the paradox is, or yet another paradox is, that process of forgetting or oblivion is baked into the process from the beginning, and you can see it taking shape at almost every stage of the evolution of Christian thought. The first element of it is St. Paul's idea that something is written on the heart, that the moral law is written on the heart. That's something that he gets from the Old Testament, but nevertheless, it takes on a proportion. It sort of becomes the centerpiece of Christian belief. The second main thing is the late medieval tendency that you find in Scotus and Occam and others, whereby removing lengthy chains of reasoning, removing the Aristotelian categories, removing the universals that we opened our discussion with, is how you see the truth more clearly. And that the true revelation comes when every impediment and barrier and chain and long scholastic arguments are removed, and you are left with the late medieval tendency whereby there's some kind of internal vision, internal piety, whereby you see the truth. Every person sees the truth most clearly. That is Luther's theory of faith alone. That is that you will still hear in almost every context of Western moral thinking, that you listen to your conscience, you find the right way within you, you find the truth by looking, or the enlighteners looking at nature, the observation of the way things truly are. Newton and Galileo and Rousseau, that looking without these reasonings and so forth is how you perceive the truth. Now, that's all well and good as long as you believe these things. But if you push that far enough, you can get to a kind of almost atheism. And there's a sense in which, Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and company, that they are the heirs of Calvin and Luther more so than Galileo and Newton and company, because they think that when the veil is lifted, you see the truth most clearly. Now, every so often, you will also find yet another paradox within Western and Christian thinking. The theological foundation, or the fundamental beliefs that underpin something, suddenly reassert themselves. Some people say that that's what the Reformation was like. Some people say that that's what the Enlightenment was like, because you have in the Enlightenment both this notion of tearing away the veil of obscurity from nature, but also that was the time of the great awakening, or a religious revival in England and America, and that everybody from Hume to Kant are telling us that reason, unaided reason, will reveal the truth of morality, as you said before, or reveal what right conduct is, and that these things are obvious and clear to everybody. Now, what I would say is what they've actually done is they've just said, well, all these old Christian assumptions about what morality is or what right living is like, they've just pulled away the theological metaphysical foundations, and they've said, well, I can nevertheless show you how this appeals to reason and so forth. Now, another paradox, that is exactly the spirit of Aquinas and company, that he wants to show you that you have all these theological propositions and so forth, but there's also this sort of logical thinking which is practically synonymous with Aristotle, and that the two actually can be brought together somehow. So the later evolution of that mode of thought just privileges the sort of rational one. But again, that can eventually goes so far that you forget the original foundation, and I would say that that's the position that we are in. And we are unable to define and explain why we believe as we think we should.
Yeah. So I apologize. I'm asking you super hard questions, but it's your fault. You brought them all up in your book.
My fault.
That's it's all your fault. That's why I love your book. It's like you did not shy away from any of the sort of biggest questions in philosophy and theology and history for the last 2,000 years. And you somehow did it so clearly in a couple hundred pages. So you're talking about paradoxes. So that's your chapter 10, the paradoxes of liberalism. The last part of your book was just fantastic. And you talk about the paradoxes, then you talk about the challenges. Chapter 12, you say, is there a way out? It's titled A Way Out. And you say this, and I want to read this, quote, liberalism cannot create or sustain communities as it tends to erode pre-existing societies and associations in its effort to secure individual freedom. This, I contend, is the most significant problem with liberalism, and all its other problems stem from it. Liberalism, therefore, threatens to usher in not a new age of freedom, but its own dissolution. And on page 94, you also say, I think this was in the paradoxes part, you say that Christian assumptions created the secular, and liberal assumptions began to resemble a religion. So I wonder if you could unpack for us it almost sounds a bit Marxian. I know you're probably not a Marxist, but the capitalism being a universal acid, all that is holy is profaned. So it seems like liberalism has that power, and yet it also is taking on these features that appear religious in the worst sense of the term. So I wonder if you could develop that and then also comment on, is there a way out? You mentioned earlier in the conversation about a return to belief, and tell us what your thoughts are on that. So I've asked you about 4 questions altogether. You probably won't even remember them all, but tell us about a way out and what comes next.
Okay, first question. The question of creating and sustaining communities. This is an old criticism against liberalism. I didn't come up with it. It's also in Fukuyama. It's in The End of History. It's the part at the end that nobody read. The basic idea is that you cannot have a society in which every group and every individual is wholly free and is expected to engage in entirely voluntary interpersonal and intergroup associations. So think of it as a family. Like if I have a family and then everybody in the family says, well, the family's over because I'm going to go and do my own. I mean, that's just not, you won't have a family, you won't have any kind of group association. Now, the original virtue of liberalism, according to many liberals in the 19th century, was to dissolve as many of those involuntary associations as possible. Sort of, breaking up. Marx talked about I think the term was the idiocy of rural life, and that it breaking it up and dissolving it and allowing the individual to assert his freedom against a collective was beneficial. Now, I don't think it was beneficial in all cases, but I think in many instances, those associations would have seemed oppressive and stifling. But the problem is, one would say, that the dissolution of the dissolution just doesn't stop. There's no point at which the theory of total personal freedom decides that it's gone too far, and you get the sort of atomized, that's a Hannah Arendt term. You get this sort of atomization of persons, and consequently no society. So that is a problem. And I think many well-meaning liberals, Timothy Garton Ash, very recently, argued that contemporary liberalism has to become more comfortable with those sort of layers of embedded identities and group associations and rootedness in communities and so forth. And I would agree with that. The question is whether or not that's actually possible. I would say that it was possible in that era that we called Cold War liberalism, when both left-wing and right-wing people look back on the 50s. even the sort of idealized vision of the 50s, they see a world of, on the one hand, of either strong families rooted in communities, and or a strong labor movement, and the triumph of blue collar solidarity and things like that. And I forget who said it, but there's that sort of an aphorism that the right wing wants to go home in the 1950s, and the left wing wants to go to work in the 1950s. So, that's Cold War liberalism. And there was also the height of church going and the proverbial bowling leagues and so forth. Anyway, maybe we can become comfortable with that again. So I don't know. Unless liberals can cover that spirit, we're going to have a problem with that for some time. What was your second question?
Oh my gosh, I can't remember. I was saying.
The religion. Okay,
yeah, belief.
So the second. So you have I think the best way of explaining it is again sort of in an evolutionary sense. How does liberalism come to resemble a religion, and how do the principles of in medieval thought become secularized? So they become secularized because people have been habituated to them, and because the church created this idea of a non-religious space and a religious space. As the ideas become secularized in notably John Locke's quote-unquote political theology, they become harder and harder to prove. And you have people like Hume and Kant and Rousseau and Jefferson and so on, insisting that these things they either appeal to, human equality appeals to reason, or that it's simply obvious, and so forth. But I think that that just doesn't quite work. That there's still an urge to find some kind of religious or quasi-religious foundation for these assumptions. Hence, in the French Revolution, you have the cult of reason, and then the cult of the supreme being. You have the American experiments with Freemasonry. None of these really quite work. And there's still this kind of quest for a unifying system of belief or assumptions that will underpin these formerly Christian assumptions. You have the same thing in the sort of the study of nature, that a close, both coming out of the Enlightenment and in this sort of romantic period, close observation of nature, understanding the way things truly are, looking at removing institutions and so forth, and that Newton discovering these laws of that somehow there would be a quasi-religious underpinning for these assumptions in that sort of mode of thought or sentiment. It's more like sentiment rather than a mode of thought. I don't think that worked either. But the quest didn't stop. The 19th century is full of these sort of mystical or sort of, what's the word? Not quite paranormal, although there was a lot of that, but sort of like esoteric, spiritualist things that would sort of still provide support for ideas of the immortality of the soul, or the sort of some kind of interior spiritual life and stuff like that, but they wouldn't be institutional Christianity. So hence all of the fortune telling and the seances and the table turning and the theosophy and so on that comes out of the 19th century. Now, one of the ideas that was circulated was the so-called religion of humanity. That instead of worshiping or presupposing a sort of creator, sort of divine essence that created the universe, that you sort of leave that assumption alone or sort of remain agnostic on that point, and that humanity as a whole is then elevated into into the place of a supreme. Hence, if humanity as a whole is a supreme being, hence the assumption that you would then love your fellow man, treat him with respect, and so forth, and basically affirm all these other older Christian ideas. But the justification would be the sort of quasi divinity of humanity. I think you can detect a little bit of that in Hegel, as you say. But again, I say I think because, who can be sure when Hegel writes things? But it's really associated with the Frenchman Auguste Comte, who, amongst his many other strange achievements, he also invented the word sociology, which is kind of a peculiar thing. Now, what is noteworthy about Comte? We could get into this, could occupy a great deal of time, but number one, he assumes that this religious secular divide is of absolutely fundamental importance. He views that as the greatest, supreme creation of humanity, basically of all time. He is a medievalist. He is obsessed with Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. He views the whole sort of round of monastic prayer and so forth as a pattern for the religion of humanity. The cult of the Virgin he applies to this sort of unrequited love of his. Her name was Clotilde, which is an interesting sort of medieval name also, Clotilda, and she unfortunately died. I think was married to someone else. I mean, this sort of odd thing. He was quite devoted to her, nonetheless. He loved Dante and Petrarch and the whole sort of medieval aesthetic. So he basically recreated a kind of Catholic-looking religion with a calendar of saints and with a Virgin Mary sort of figure, and a daily round of monastic prayer and so forth. Okay, so pretty weird, didn't really catch on, although there is still a temple to humanity in Paris, and I think that there are several, I think it had a bit of a heyday in Brazil. I think in Brazil they flirted with making the religion of humanity the state religion at one point. But obviously this didn't really catch on. Now, what people tend not to grasp is the enormous influence that this had on John Stuart Mill. And I think of Mill as creating, he fully embraced this idea of the religion of humanity. He was very keen on it, but in a kind of Protestant way. Didn't like the cult of the saints and the virgin veneration of this sort of lady figure, and the daily 5 times monastic prayer and so forth. But he saw his vision of liberalism as a reformed version of this religion of humanity. And if you read his works, all of them, you will find that lurking in the background, there's this vision of a clergy, sort of these well cultivated minds that have the right opinions on things, who can advise others and how to live properly, and that if people were allowed to pursue their own ends and so forth, they would eventually settle on this sort of higher mental cultivation and things like that. If you go back, though, to the writings that he made in his mid-20s, there's a work, particular one that stands out, called The Spirit of the Age. And Mill reveals himself in The Spirit of the Age as an absolutely, smitten with the Middle Ages, obsessed with the power of the high medieval papacy Gregory the Seventh and Innocent the Third as these sort of colossal figures expounding a universal consensus that sort of governed and regulated and moralized every aspect of life, and which was, in Mill's view, a progressive force. The strength was lost about the Reformation. So he's kind of like a Luther-like figure, and Comte is kind of like an Erasmus-like guy, I think. Although some people might find that a little too cheeky, but that's certainly how it seems to me. And Mill, of course, is no longer remembered as a kind of quasi-mystical medievalist at all. And again, I can't refrain from this digression. I noticed that Steven Pinker, the sort of enlightened fellow on Twitter, he was coming down on what he called, I think it was Christian nationalists or something. Now, I don't know what that is, but the problem that I detected here is this idea that there is a break with the past, that the Enlightenment and particularly John Stuart Mill and so forth, that they drew a line across history and they banished medieval thought to sort of the Trotskyite dustbin of history. And since then, liberalism has stood for enlightenment and secularism. So that is just a huge misunderstanding. That I understand that things came out in the wash, without a kind of medieval tinge, but it's still there in a sense, that this idea that there must be a kind of commanding social consensus as to what we are supposed to think about personal freedom and how we believe in these things, that is fundamentally a medieval idea which casts such a long shadow over Mill and Comte and all of their acolytes. But it becomes increasingly, I think it becomes increasingly remote as you move on. But it's still detectable in, for example, the work of the neoliberals, Hayek and his ilk, that the way they speak of the market and the forces of benevolence and generosity and human fellowship and kindness that are served, the sort of that are served by market forces and the absolute free choice and so forth of persons, that this has a religious flavor to it. And it's almost like the final stage of the Protestant vision of humanity. Now, some people may find that that's a little bit, maybe I've pushed the metaphor or something a little bit too far, but I probably not too far. I think it's just about right. Now, most people, I think, no longer see market forces like this. This is kind of like a late 80s, 1990s thing that went absolutely unquestioned. That that the right orientation of all of humanity, and that the sort of service to one's fellow man and so forth was best instantiated through the market, through devotion to the market and so forth. That strikes probably a lot of people as a little odd, but within living memory, it certainly did not. That was the doctrine of the day, and I see it as another form of the religion of humanity. The question for us now is, what is next?
Yeah, what's next? You mentioned Pinker and the Enlightenment, and my sense is that, to your points about elevating this cult of reason, we still have many leaders and pundits in society in Canada who will say, we just need to get back to reason. We need to rescue reason. It's an Enlightenment value. And I would say connected with this elevation of reason is a very Enlightenment approach of saying that metaphysical questions are irrelevant. In fact, they don't have any content The extreme example of this was Sigmund Freud, when he said, anyone who talks about meaning and purpose is by definition mentally ill, because meaning and purpose don't exist. And yet what we're finding right on the front pages of our newspapers are, well, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? So these are fundamental questions about anthropology. What do we know? How do we know what we know? So epistemology, ontology.
Yeah.
And this is the poet Horace, I believe it was Horace, who said you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but she keeps running right back. And that's what we're experiencing right now today. Nature has run back. You can't avoid asking the big metaphysical questions forever. And reason, we love reason. Of course we love reason, but it has limits. And Hayek, this is what I like about Hayek. He said, even if you had all the information in the world, we still don't have someone smart enough to process it all. So he'd say that's his basis of his knowledge problem. We don't have enough data, and we don't have any way to process it. And that's why he championed the market. But all of this to say, I think we're at a moment which is
exactly what someone would have said, say, circa, around, say, 1250. That's exactly what someone would have said at that time, except instead of the word market, the word would have been God. So that's why I make that comparison.
Brilliant. So we need to figure out a way to close this, because really you've tried to capture the whole of 2,000 years into 200 pages, and all of this is fascinating to me. What have I not asked you about? What have we missed?
So insofar as, look, I think it's self-evident, and I mean that literally. I think it is self-evident that in any Western context, you are not going to get anywhere in terms of a political or social doctrine that does not stress personal freedom. No one is going to listen to that. And the idea that there is some kind of post-liberal future, I know that nobody actually says, but it's often perceived as the idea that there's some kind of post-liberal future in which we all give up freedom, or like cease to put any emphasis on freedom, that's wrong. Even the most even the totalitarian movements of the 20th century talked about freedom, and there's a reason for that, because it's just so deeply ingrained. The question is not freedom versus tyranny, at least not right now. Maybe it was in, say, Eastern Europe in the mid 20th century, but even the communists talked about freedom. The question is, what is freedom for, and what should we do with it? Kind of the same question, but phrased differently. It won't do anymore to insist that those questions don't matter, that you should just be free and do whatever you want. That clearly hasn't produced the good life or a happy, well-functioning society. And I lay this all out in I forget what it is, chapter 3 of the book. It's early on in the book. The promises of the end of history and the sort of new dawn of freedom just haven't led to a happier, more optimistic life. There are more people than ever within, the last, 70 years or something, who say life was better before. They feel that humanity is doomed and things like that. So, as you said, I think that that's clearly a question of meaning and purpose. And liberalism is designed specifically not to give that kind of meaning and purpose, which is fine, but it often feels to me as though contemporary liberalism wants to say that you shouldn't think about those things at all, or if you do, you're entirely on your own, and you can only find it within yourself. Now, I'm not going to say that that's totally impossible, but I think for most people, it's beyond what they're capable of. And I would include myself in that. I don't think that if I had been left alone to sort of invent my own worldview and to just sort of like my own belief system, that I would not really be very successful, and I would probably go crazy in the in the process. Such things are already available to us, that we have a long past of things that have worked. We know what, this was the subject of my previous book, in Defense of Civilization, that, of past examples that worked. It sounds almost idiotic to say it, but that's how culture is transmitted and revived and so on. And that as long as liberalism remains a kind of protest against that, or a kind of or a doctrine of freedom is used simply to wear down, community ties or old institutions and so forth, we are not going to be able to establish a well-functioning society. And I guess what we're going to have to do is somehow, liberals are just going to have to become at ease with that. And for the record, I would, insofar as I believe in the importance of human freedom and the exercise of free will and the right use of freedom, I am a liberal. But I don't believe that we should just all do whatever we want all the time and believe things for no reason and not understand where our beliefs come from. So that leads to my second point, or I don't know, well, anyway, it leads to another point, which is that I think that the doctrine of freedom, liberalism, has been most successful when it has been inspired and animated, underpinned by, and you find that, I think, very evidently in the campaign to abolish slavery, in the American civil rights movement, in the struggle against the South African apartheid, and in the fall, in the collapse of the USSR. Collapse of the USSR is one of the most, I think, misunderstood of recent quote-unquote triumphs of liberalism, because it was ushered in by a Christian, an explicitly Christian movement, the Solidarity trade union, and the backing by Pope John Paul II. Eastern Europe only became liberal insofar, people will, I think Anne Applebaum thinks that it's not liberal, but it only, insofar as it has become liberal at all, that happened as a byproduct of the Christian movement against Soviet communism. So when we think about George H.W. Bush and Reagan and Thatcher and company sort of shaking their fists at the USSR and watching the wall come down as a sort of triumph of Western liberalism, that's a bit of a misunderstanding, that the door was open to liberalism by a theological movement, and it was not the other way around. And you can think of Desmond Tutu and South Africa, Martin Luther King Jr. and the American Civil Rights Movement. These are and clergymen who were able to explain precisely why all men were created equal, for example.
Yeah. So your point about the beauty of liberalism, I would agree with you. Liberalism is very useful because it is a thin philosophy. And as long as we have a rich cultural, a thick cultural fabric, then liberalism can work quite well. However, if we continue to eat away at that cultural fabric, it ends up as a philosophy without roots. But Dr. Bonner, thank you so much. We've tried to solve the world's most difficult problems, and you've done it well and articulately. I really appreciate this time, and we'll have links to your books. And I want to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas, and thanks again for spending time with us.
Pleasure.